Shalom and greetings from Jerusalem. This is Dr. Chan. I'm here at the Israel Museum and the Shrine of the Book, and we're going to talk today a bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now you can see just behind me, to my left, you can see the Shrine of the Book and the Israel Museum on the right. The Shrine of the Book is actually a museum that is specifically dedicated to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can go in there and see copies of the scrolls. It's a fascinating place. If you're ever here in Jerusalem, you should put that at the top of your priority list. So this short video has two purposes, and is in fact to answer two questions. The first one is this: what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? And then the second one, I guess, is kind of a two-part question. What can the Dead Sea Scrolls teach us about the composition of the Bible? And then as a follow-up to that, what might we learn about theology, our theology and our own understanding of the scriptures and how they came to be? What can we learn about that from the Dead Sea Scrolls? Let's begin with the facts. What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, in the summer of 1947, a number of scrolls began to show up, began to turn up in Bethlehem, and they were sold by Bedouin. The legend goes that a Bedouin boy had thrown a stone up into a cave and heard something break, and in fact went up there and found some jars that were full of ancient manuscripts, ancient scrolls, and those were then taken and sold in Bethlehem. Now there were, after people discovered where those were found, further work was done and additional scrolls were found. All told, some 825 Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek scrolls from a total of 11 caves were found at this place called Khirbet Qumran, which is near the Dead Sea. These scrolls date from the 4th century BCE, or sometimes you refer to as BC, all the way up to the 1st century CE, around 70 CE, or 70 of the Common Era, 70 AD. Now, why are these important from the perspective of understanding the Bible and composition? About 200 of those scrolls are biblical scrolls. That is, they're scrolls that contain scrolls that represent biblical books. Every single book in the Hebrew Bible is represented, and sometimes in multiple versions, except for the book of Esther. It's not entirely clear why Esther isn't presented, and with respect to the calendrical texts, that is, texts that were found there that refer to the calendar, so a liturgical calendar or ritual calendar, they also don't mention Purim, which is the book of Esther is kind of the etiological story for Purim. So Esther is missing, but every other book is represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and oftentimes in multiple and even variant versions. Now, why is this important at all? Some people have said that the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, was the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century, at least for biblical studies and for people interested in the history of Israel. Why might that be? Well, pick up whatever Bible that you have. Turn and flip through your Old Testament, and you'll look at books like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Genesis, and ask yourself the question: on what manuscript were those books based? On what manuscript and how old is the manuscript on which your English Bibles, the Old Testament part of your English Bibles, are based? Well, that manuscript is medieval, in fact, from roughly around 1009 AD. Okay, so that's roughly 1,000 years after the time of the New Testament, and over 1,000 years from when you consider when those Old Testament books were actually written. That is a lot of time between when these books were written and the manuscript that we use to create our New Testament. So what the Dead Sea Scrolls represent are manuscripts that are much older and much closer to the time at which these manuscripts would have actually been composed. So it's really important from the perspective of translation and from the perspective of understanding how these biblical texts developed. Prior to 1947, prior to the discovery of these scrolls, we were really dependent on medieval manuscripts. And now we have the opportunity to check those manuscripts over and against these scrolls that were the scrolls that were found at Khirbet Qumran, or the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so you can see how important that might be. We can learn about how much development happened between the Dead Sea Scrolls, the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the time of the medieval manuscripts that we have, and we can see how much change occurred and even what kinds of changes occurred. So as you can see, from the perspective of translation and textual criticism, this was a profoundly important discovery. Sorry about some of that background noise. Another important point to keep in mind is that sometimes these Dead Sea Scrolls bear witness to variant texts. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is texts that are different from the manuscripts, the medieval manuscripts on which all of our English Bibles are based. Let me give you an example of that. A Targum from Dead Sea Scrolls of the Book of Job, or a version of the Book of Job, found actually in Cave 11, is missing a number of verses near the end of the Book of Job. In fact, Job 42, 12 through 17 are missing from this particular manuscript, though those verses are present in the manuscripts that we use to translate. Or a manuscript of the Book of Psalms, also found in Cave 11, puts some of the Psalms in a different order, and it raises questions about when the current form of the Psalms, or we should say, when the form of the Psalms that we use came to be. And this happens throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls corpus. I know another interesting example of this is that two different Hebrew versions of Jeremiah are represented. One which is closer to the manuscript that we use from the medieval period, and another which is closer to the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint is a Greek translation and was in fact the version of the Bible, the version of the Old Testament that would have been used in a different church. Now, in the early church, I'm sorry, not in a different church, but it was in fact the version of the Old Testament that was used by the early church. Now, what's interesting about the Jeremiah manuscript is that in Greek, it is about 1/7 shorter. The Septuagint version used by the early church was about 1/7 shorter than the Hebrew text that we use today. So that's an interesting thing to point out, because the Bible that would have been used by the early church, the version of Jeremiah, in fact, would have been a version that was different than the one that you and I use. And it's not different just in terms of you know, the length of sentences or things like that. Even the arrangement of the chapters themselves are different at certain points. Sometimes you have minor expansions. For instance, the title of a king might be longer in the Hebrew version than in the Greek, and that's somewhat superficial. But you also have some other major differences in which certain chapters are arranged in different ways. It's not, the details aren't that important right now. What's most important is that you recognize that this book of Jeremiah, you know, that the early church would have been using a very different version of the book of Jeremiah. Another interesting note to point out is that about 200 of these scrolls are from the Bible. The others are non-biblical scrolls. And of those 200, the most frequently attested books are Deuteronomy and the Psalms and the book of Isaiah. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because those are the three books that are most frequently cited and utilized in the New Testament. Okay, so that's very interesting. It seems as what one might suggest, that the books that were most formative for this Qumran community were also deeply formative for the early Christian community. So that's just another interesting little fact. But what is all this? Sorry, let's let that bus go by. What does all of this mean for us from a theological perspective? Well, I would say a couple different things. First of all, God's word didn't arrive from heaven as, you know, in a nice and neat package. But what this manuscript indicates to us is that the books of the Bible arose from within specific communities that use these texts in their own religious life. So that is, the Bible did not arrive, you know, like neatly packaged in this little gift box on the wings of a stork. Rather, it arose from within specific historical circumstances, and sometimes, and as part of those historical circumstances, multiple versions of certain books arose. So it is actually impossible for us in the current day to speak, for instance, about the book of Jeremiah, or the book of Psalms, because in fact, as we look through the history of the manuscript history of these books, we quickly discover that there never was a single book of Psalms or a single book of Jeremiah. These went through various versions, and so this should qualify and help us rethink what we mean by Word of God. And the book of Jeremiah is particularly interesting in this regard because, especially when you consider that the early church would have been using a very different book of Jeremiah than you and I use today. They would have had they would be looking at a very different kind of book, and so I think that those sorts of historical observations should help us think more in a more sophisticated way about what God's Word is. God's Word, or the Bible as we think about it, was subject to the vagaries and the ebbs and flows of history, and God, sorry, another truck going by. And God never steps in to intervene in this process, right? All of these texts stand together, and that's a remarkable thing to consider. We cannot, in fact, talk about the Word of God or to say that, the Bible that we have is the Bible that has always been, because that is simply not the case. The Bible has been on a journey, and a very complex journey, in fact, one in which discrepancies have arisen, and in which different forms of books has arisen. So that's important to keep in mind from a theological perspective, that when we talk about the Word of God, we're talking about a very complex book, and I think as theologians, we can think about the Spirit's work in all of those different communities, even the ones that use versions of the Bible that are different than ours. That entire process, I think we can talk about the Spirit's work in and through that whole process. Secondly, these texts help us rethink the category of revelation. You see, what I think these, the Dead Sea Scrolls and other text-critical evidence show us is that we need to rethink the category of revelation. And that revelation is not about receiving some kind of divine download from heaven, but it involves human scribal activity, it involves human creativity, inspiration, deep reflection on the nature of life and on God's creation, and all of this, even the human creativity, has a role in the process of revelation. That is, human faculties, things that humans bring to it, are part of the revelatory process and are not, in fact, as I see it, a hindrance to revelation. In fact, this is precisely the way in which revelation occurs through the Bible. And then finally, I would say this. The Bible is not a Word of God because it perfectly reflects what a prophet saw or what a prophet heard in a vision or something like that. It's a Word of God at the moment in which the reader or the hearer hears herself addressed by God through the Spirit. It's not about finding, it's not about, every word being perfectly and historically accurate. It's about the encounter that happens when you and I pick up that text and God addresses us through the Spirit through that text. This is the end of this section of the lecture. I'm so glad you were able to join me here in Jerusalem. I'll look forward to talking with you soon.